Welcome back, everyone. So we do have Andrew Clark here. He's going to be providing a presentation on active school travel and the built environment. So Dr. Andrew Clark is a researcher with over 20 years of experience in the fields of geography, geographic information systems, and public health. After spending 10 years at Western University's Human Environments Analysis Laboratory, Andrew has moved on to open his own consulting firm called Healthy Way Consulting and work as a partial load professor in GIS and planning at Fanshawe College. His background includes over a decade working with the Elgin London Middlesex Oxford Active and Safe Routes to School partnership, where he has used an evidence-based approach to lead the development and implementation of school travel planning and AST-related interventions in schools throughout the ELMO region. Andrew, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Oh, guess it helps if I unmute. Thanks, Dylan. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, everyone, for having me today, and I'm looking forward to talk to you a bit about active school travel and the built environment and how the two are related. Just a little self-promotion. Follow Twitter, LinkedIn to learn more about sort of the work that I do. As we go through that. And thanks for the bio break because it allowed me to finish brewing my coffee. Okay, so what I'll be talking about today is I'm going to start by talking about the definition of active school travel and the benefits, which I can breeze over, as that was nicely covered already. And then talking about the current status of AST in Canada, getting into the socio-ecological model and the sort of the correlates related to active school travel, and then focusing on the built environment related interventions, and then finally focusing on some policy. So I have about 20 minutes to talk, and then hopefully you guys have some questions and happy to answer at that point. I guess I should also say, along with my credentials that Dylan kindly shared with me, or shared with all of you, there's also, I have extensive research in this field. During my time at Western, I did a lot of work on active school travel and focusing on applications to it, so community-based research related to it. So I come from a lot of different perspectives that really will help sort of frame this argument and this question. So first of all, what is active school travel? And I'm sure I'm not surprising anyone in this room, but it's defined as any mode of human-powered transportation to or from school. So it includes rolling using scooters, skateboards, and rollerblades, walking, and cycling. Now, why is it important? And Vicky has already touched on this a bit, but to bring it back to the literature, active school travel is connected with multiple health, social, environmental, and economic benefits at the individual and population level. Children who actively travel to school engage in more daily physical activity and have higher energy expenditure. Active school travel is linked to better academic performance and healthy brain development. And it's also children who actively travel are also exposed to less air pollution. They have reduced risk of asthma, cognitive deficits, and school absenteeism due to this lower levels of exposure. Now, active school travel in Canada is quite, it's relative to what we're actually measuring. One of the key parts that we have to always consider when we're looking at this is what is the percentage out of? And because we know that school bus kids that are eligible for the school bus, aren't actively traveling. So you're going to see some very ugly numbers of the percentage of kids in the U.S. traveling. But in Canada, our numbers are actually not too bad. So a recent report from the active transportation section from Participation, the 2022 report card, suggests that almost 50% of kids are actively traveling, with boys more likely to actively travel than girls. And this is of all children. So, because we also know that about 35 to 40% of kids in Canada are also bused to school. So that does play a part in sort of what our maximum number of active travelers could be. And you can also see the comparison of sort of winter versus spring. So this is surveys taken in December and July. So this would be based on June numbers. This would be based on probably November numbers. So you can sort of see that it actually doesn't change that much, even though we are a winter climate. Just emphasizing the fact that We do actively travel all year round, right? So to better understand why these patterns exist in across our across the literature, we really need to think about the factors influencing active school travel. And to help us understand that, we turn to the socioecological model. And the idea of a socioecological model is that we have factors at different levels, from the individual factors or interpersonal to interpersonal factors, so that of our social environment, to the physical environment around us, and then finally to policy level. And for this presentation, I'll be mostly focusing on this physical environment level. But it's important to acknowledge that they don't exist in isolation, because this is sort of like a nested doll, because each of the factors influences each other in some ways. So my own personal perceptions of the environment influences how it actually affects my behavior. And those policy environment influences what physical environment infrastructure can actually be implemented, as well as things like the distance to school and how many sidewalks are there. So each of these are played interchangeably between each level to help identify our actual behaviors. Now, before I get into talking about AST and the built environment, there's two different aspects of the physical environment that impact AST. And it's really important to remember these two different elements. In most of the academic literature, we focus on the built environment. And what that really means is the citywide factors that can be measured using municipal data. Because if you think of how we do research, it is usually a large data set of some kind. We have people from all across the city participating, or all across the country in the case of some of the examples you'll see in what I'm talking about today. And you can't look at every little element. You can look at big pieces of information that's available. Things like land use, zoning, road design, sidewalks. But these are also things that are really hard to change in the short term. If you do change them, they do make a huge impact on a large population. So that's the other side of it. But the things that a lot of these programs talk about, and when you think about some of the things Vicky was talking about, we're really talking about local engineering elements. It refers to traffic calming and safety features that make a difference locally to residents, but they're hard to measure over large areas. So things like curb cutouts, speed humps, minimizing the road width, closing roads down for different periods of time, right? Speed cameras. All these elements are things that are really impactful locally, but they're hard to measure at that big level. So I'm going to take both of those perspectives into account during this presentation. I'm going to start talking about the larger scale things and then focusing on the smaller. The first is the number one aspect in any type of research around active school travel. It is distance. Distance refers to the distance between a child's home and their school. Generally speaking, the best way is to measure that using the distance between their home to school. But we don't always have information like postal codes or their home addresses to be able to measure that directly. So in a lot of cases, it's perception about those distances. But we know in pretty much every case that it's a factor that's added to our models, that distance is significant. It drives the decision whether kids walk or not to school. It's not the only thing, but it's the leading cause or leading factor determining whether someone walks or not. So here I just have a map of a school in London, in an urban area of London, and you can see sort of the distances on pedestrian networks. So this includes both streets and pathways that someone can walk to the school based on a 3.2 kilometer buffer on the outside. So think high school walking distance, to a 1.6, to a 1 kilometer, and then a 500 meters. And all this to acknowledge the fact that in the literature, the distance people are willing to walk, and I'm talking about adults now, is about 400 meters. Okay? So that's the average distance people are willing to walk. So with the distance element, we have something we need to overcome to help increase the number of kids that walk to school. The first element of actually the built environment is the land use mix. So land use mix refers to the diversity or amount of mix within a community of, of what their land uses are. So is it mostly a residential land use like you see in suburban neighborhoods? Or are there different land use types mixed together to create a much more diverse neighborhood? Most research shows that if land use mix increases, active transportation researches. And this is for the general public. But for kids, this is a little more confusing because there's a lot of inconsistencies. Some papers actually show the same relationship as with the general public, but we also see some negative relationships where the more mix there is, the less likely kids are to actively travel. Because if you think about an environment in an urban core where there's lots of things happening, there's also a lot more dangers associated with that, and those perceptions increase. So we actually do find some of the opposite effects to that, based on the environment that kids are living in and where the research is being done. The next is intersection density. And intersection density measures the amount of intersections, either three-way or four-way intersections, that are within a given area. And what I mean by three-way and four-way intersections, a T intersection like you see here is a perfect example of a three-way intersection. You have three segments of roads intersecting together, creating a T. So there's three directions cars could be coming from. And then we have the classic four-way intersection where you have the cross, the X, whatever you want to call it, where four cars are coming from four directions and kids need to interact with that. Generally speaking, again, high density of intersections means a neighborhood has short grid-like blocks, like you see up here. A low density intersection neighborhood is a neighborhood with many cul-de-sacs and significantly fewer four-way intersections, as you see below. And research generally shows, for all active travel as well as for children, that as intersection density increases, AST behavior increases as well. And the idea of that is it's short. There's more direct ways to travel from one location to another because you can easily jigsaw your way through that. Where here, in this kind of environment, if your school is located up here somewhere and you're walking from down here, there's no real direct way to go. You have to take a whole bunch of out-of-the-way ways to get to your school. Next is population density, and this is a fairly consistent finding across all the literature, that population density or dwelling density is also something that's used. It refers to the number of people or dwellings located within an area per square kilometer. So we might take areas like this and focus on a buffer around 1.6 kilometers around the school and calculate it within that area, or do it based on each individual home. So basically a high density, there are a lot of people living in close proximity to each other, like we see in this bottom example. And in the top one, is there a small number of people living close to each other? So people are spread out, long driveways, lot of spaces between different houses. It's just a low density. And research generally shows that as population or dwelling density increases, AST behavior increases as well. And that comes down to a couple different elements. The one is eyes on the street. The more houses closer together, it means parents feel more comfortable allowing the children to walk because there's more people around. There's less concern about things like stranger danger and bullying and that kind of thing because there's lots of people. The more people there are, the more likely people are comfortable allowing their children to walk to school. Another common measure that's found in the literature is sidewalk presence. And you can see here a few different examples of sidewalks on one side of the street, sidewalks on two sides of the street, sidewalks along the street, right? And then no sidewalks at all. And across the province, we have various examples of all of these that in even new developments, we're still seeing some streets with no sidewalks being built on them. And it does impact the ability for children to walk to school. The presence of sidewalks can be a binary variable based on the presence or absence of sidewalks between home and school. We also sometimes do something called a ratio of sidewalks to roads, where we want to see a ratio as close to 2, suggesting there's 2 sidewalks for every single road intersection or road segment. So that's what we'd like to see. Research generally shows that as sidewalk availability increases, AST behavior increases as well. Now, the last actual measure of the built environment used is traffic volume, and it refers to how busy traffic is along the routes that children are walking. Are the roads major arteries with lots of traffic during pickup and drop-off times, or are the roads local streets with minimal traffic? And you can even get local roads with a lot of traffic, right? So that traffic volume can decrease AST behavior. So the last piece I want to talk about is a combination metric, and you're going to see this used in, the media likes to use walkability indices a lot because it's a good way to say in a quick snapshot how walkable is this neighborhood. So what happens is Lawrence Frank's work out of British Columbia is the most famous of this, and it's actually used as part of the city of Vancouver's, they use it in their planning process, trying to increase walkability. And it involves 4 different metrics all combined. Population density, land use mix, intersection density, all of which I've talked about already, and then commercial floor area ratio, which is basically a fancy name for parking minimums within an environment. So if you're talking about a commercial property, you have 2 floors of a mall. So what's the ratio of that floor area divided by the ratio of the entire parcel? So you can see what that ratio looks like. Overall, findings in research show that walkability increases, AST behavior increases as well, but there's a difficulty with these kinds of metrics because, first of all, you don't know how each of these elements play a part in those findings. As well as it's hard to make policy decisions based on something complex like this. Now that you've heard a bit about the AST and the built environment, I kind of want to put this into perspective because while we know sort of generally from a city building standpoint, what are the factors that influence active school travel, we can't just all of a sudden increase density. We can't all of a sudden just do all these things. So this is where the local elements come in. And we also have to understand with those local elements, like that I'll talk about in a second, that there's also a difference between perceptions and reality. If parents perceive that the environment is dangerous because of X, Y, and Z, is it actually happening? And that's not always the case. A recent systematic review by Rothman and colleagues show that there are different relationships between the objective measures of the built environment and perceived measures. They differ. Just because you think there's no safe ways to get to school doesn't mean there actually is. So that means we need to determine, as health promoters, as school board officials, as researchers, which issues can be addressed by interventions, which ones can be addressed by policy, and then if all else fails, what actually needs to be changed in the built environment to increase the safety and improve perceptions. So all this to say, so what? We've done all this work, we understand the environment influences, but how can we start addressing some of the barriers to AST? We do it through policy and practice, and the practice being interventions, many of which were just explained in the previous presentation, but also through policies and procedures that can help improve the environment that we're living in and kids are interacting with on a daily basis. So I do want to talk about the 6 E's of school travel planning, which thankfully have already been covered. So I will not redo it or go over it again. But I just want to add this little flavor to it where we have the 4 main elements that are part of the actual interventions. Encouragement, education, engineering, and enforcement. And that is quite literally the order you do them in. Encouragement and education is the first steps. We want to establish that these things are happening, people are aware, they know the proper way to use it. And then we start looking at engineering solutions because there are some things that we still need to fix about our environment. Enforcement, and I know Ontario Active School Travel has actually sort of removed enforcement from their school travel planning work. Across the province, we're obviously seeing enforcement, police services sort of being removed from school travel planning efforts due to equity issues. So this is sort of the last element, but in some cases it's needed, whether that's from police or from or from, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank here, from the bylaw officers, right? Sometimes it does need to happen after many reminders and working with families. But all that comes within the scope of equity and evaluation. Everything we do needs to have an equity lens to it. We need to think of how do we make this work for everyone in our school community? And knowing that school community as well helps. So how do we make sure that we're addressing language barriers, differences in abilities? How do we make sure that the work we're doing isn't offensive and is providing everyone the opportunity to participate, right? Even kids on the bus who can't participate in an active school travel project because they're taking the bus every day. How do we engage them? Whether that's walking around the field when they get to school, whether that's encouraging them to walk to the bus stop, which continues to be an issue in some communities. All those sort of come up piece of that equity lens that we want to take on our work. And then there's the evaluation piece, understanding that evidence-based decision-making is still an important part of the work we all do. And from a taxpayer standpoint, from a municipality standpoint, from a school board standpoint, we're expected to do this work with an evidence focus. And if we're not using that evidence to drive the decisions we're making and using best practices, we're failing ourselves. So I think it's important to evaluate, even if it's just using others' evaluations to inform the work we're doing. Now, I do want to talk about some of the things that happen before we even get to engineering changes, because perception is a major element of that. So campaigns like I Walk Day or Spring into Spring, Winter Walk Day, Bike Week, and so many others that we've done over the years, these campaigns are easy to complete. They're universal. Everyone gets to participate. It's easy to build equity into them. Recent research, actually not that recent, I think it's 2013. It feels recent to me, but the study of I Walk Day in California found that 101% increase in AST rates due to a campaign like this, and it was sustained for at least 2 weeks. I will remind you though, the rates start at like 14% and increase to 30%. We're already at 35-40% here in London. So as Vicky said earlier, don't expect this 100% change. We don't have that as much room to move. That doesn't mean this isn't worthwhile doing, because we still have a lot of work to do to clean up those parking lots, to get cars away from the street, schools, and increase perceptions of safety, as has already mentioned. A study of Nevada Moves Day shows an increase from 7% to 17% at intervention schools. Again, seeing those low levels. Policy is another element to this, and policy can be implemented at the school level. And back in 2008-ish, the Canadian Healthy Schools Standard was implemented in schools, and this changed how AST was sort of adapted within schools. All of a sudden became more of a focus, because healthy schools, increasing physical activity, it kind of became part of what was actually happening. So there's other policies either at a school level or an individual level, at a board level, that can really increase active school travel and change the conversations within the schools. Even adding it as an agenda item on your school council can start those conversations in the right direction. Encouragement campaigns like Walking School Bus is another example, where a project in Houston found an increase in AST from 23 to 54%, and 36% decrease in driving by implementing the Walking School Bus. And we have an awesome program here in Ontario that has been adapted for use within Ontario schools by the Canadian Cancer Society. And they're more than happy to collaborate with schools to try to train people and get that working within schools. Then there's the education. Yes, changing perceptions help by encouraging, but we also have to show families that walking to school is safe. And we can do that by teaching them how to walk safely, both parents and children. So we know road safety education programs are very successful. They've been done all over the world. We have launched a whole bunch of them in London area, but it's really a great way to sort of get people thinking about how to be safer, and are things really as dangerous as they seem? So we've found a lot of programs that have launched in schools, and they provided an increase in knowledge. Kids are doing the tests before and after, and showing significant improvements in their knowledge. We also have bike education programs that are very successful as well, and they show measurable increase in skill and knowledge after completing the program, which should increase the confidence level of parents, saying, yes, our environment may not be quite as dangerous as we may have thought. Here's some examples of some of the ones we do locally in London. We have we have roundabouts training. We do, this was pre-COVID, but we did safety presentations in school, which can be done by the police, the health units, researchers, teachers, kids themselves, right? Engaging in those materials. Education around pedestrian crossovers, safety videos and practical exercises, teaching kids how to cross the road safely at a pedestrian crossover, for instance, and then actually CAN bike and bike training programs. And this kind of takes us to engineering. And engineering is one of those big things. People usually start school travel planning, for instance, because they want those engineering changes to happen. They want to see these big money spent in their community, which is a great idea. Now, engineering changes in New York City, for instance, have been, let me take a step back. Research findings, these are research findings on cumulative changes, which means over a 10-year period, what have we seen as a result of these? And we're seeing significant declines in both deaths and injuries across the board. Okay? In examples in New York City, Texas, California. Here's some examples of engineering changes, and these are the things that parents want to see, and they can see because they're noticeable changes in their neighborhood. Things like pedestrian crossovers, sidewalk infill, connecting paths. So for instance, getting kids out of walking through parking lots and getting them outside of those areas of danger. Adding things like speed cushions in raised intersections, curb extensions, and even speed cameras can really increase the safety children feel and parents feel when walking to and from school, and actually address some of the key components of safety that children and families experience. Because perception is one thing, but some of these are actually an issue, right? Speeding in intersections, going through stop signs, all these things actually do occur. So when I talk about perceptions versus reality, I'm not saying they're never there. They just are there. We just have to be aware of those differences when we're making these decisions, because these do cost money. Okay. So from that comes sort of all the E's, aka school travel planning. We can do all these things together, and this is where we see some of the greatest impact at the local level. Overall, measurably, we're not seeing quite as some of the effects as we do on the short term for those other elements, but we're talking about long-term, year-over-year changes here. So for instance, showing an increase in AST during the pilot of school travel planning from 44% to 46% is a big win when we're talking about 30 schools or 24 schools, whatever was part of that pilot. Showing a 4% increase in 106 elementary schools in Canada is a win. That's a great thing. And then showing the big one down here in 53 schools across the U.S., they found an overall increase from 13 to 18% and from 9.8 to 15%. These are fairly decent numbers when we're talking about a large population from different schools across the nation. So by building on these different elements, addressing the perceptions, addressing the real built environment aspects of AST, we're able to make changes. Now, before I wrap up and take a couple questions, I do want to focus on a little bit on AST built environment policies. Over a 1 year period that ended last May-ish, we at the HEAL Lab, when I was working there, we worked with Ontario Active School Travel Council and Green Communities Canada to conduct a policy scan on policies around active school travel. So many of you in this room are part of those consultations, and I thank you for being part of that. And during those steps, we really develop policies to help you understand what is needed from a policy standpoint. And so you can scan this QR code to download the final policy scan report that's on OAST's website. And a few take-home messages from this are regarding the recommendations we've developed. The first is increased collaboration regarding sustainability, school setting, and school closures. And that's between ministry, school boards, municipalities, all having a say in how these different decisions get made. Ensuring that our schools are in communities that are ever increasingly sustainable, that are more dense, that better support school travel. We also recommend developing active school travel zones in our communities, which allow policy and practice to really focus on changing the conversation around what is a school zone, which most municipalities now have properties that touch or streets touching the school property, which is not as helpful as it was intended to be. Also increasing pedestrian infrastructure and traffic calming in school zones. Make sure people feel safe and they can travel to school safely actively. Improving drop-off areas to focus on pedestrians, cyclists, and school buses. Get those cars out of there, right? Finding ways to minimize the cars, make it hard to get your kids to school by driving. Making walking and biking the easy way, and less people will do it. And then finally, developing a traffic management plan for each school. Having the facilities and school personnel and the municipality work together to create these traffic management plans that can be used to help understand the flow of traffic around the school neighborhood to minimize the impact it has on people trying to actively travel. There's just some examples of it, but that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And you can connect with me as follows, and there's my contact information there. And you can view my website by scanning the QR code as well. Happy to take any questions now.
Thanks, Andrew. I do